Was this brought forth, do you suspect, by some of the names that Donald Trump has suggested to run the FBI, to run the Justice Department? Why this late decision by a president who seemed to have already made up his mind?
Well, I think it's a reasonable inference that there's a connection between some of the names that Trump has been putting forward as his intended nominees to run the FBI and to run the Department of Justice and this decision. The decision also, of course, came at the end of a holiday weekend, Thanksgiving, when Joe Biden was with his family, including Hunter Biden. One imagines that also played a role. But it's surprising. It's surprising in part because Joe Biden has said repeatedly that he was not intending to and would not pardon his son. It's surprising because of the breadth of the pardon. I mean, that's extremely unusual. It's for any and all potential crimes that Hunter may have committed over a very long period, I think from 2014 up until the present. Usually pardons are specific with respect to particular crimes that a person has been charged with or convicted of. And so I'd say in particular, it's that breadth that does suggest the connection between the names like Kash Patel that have been put forward, who has spoken about using the Justice Department and the FBI to take vengeance on Trump's enemies and on Joe Biden and his family. So I think when you put together all of that circumstantial evidence, yeah, I think it's a reasonable inference that there's a connection there.
I spoke on the early edition of Balance of Power with Nick Ackerman, the former assistant special Watergate prosecutor. Here's what he had to say about the timing in this case.
If Harris had won the election, I don't think there would be a pardon. But I don't think he really trusts a Justice Department that's headed by Pam Bondi, Donald Trump's two defense lawyers from New York, and Kash Patel, who is going to be the FBI director, to give anybody a fair shake in the system.
What else didn't he trust, though, Professor? When you read this full and unconditional pardon, it's more sweeping than anything that we've seen since Nixon, according to most experts here, for those offenses against the U.S. which he has committed or may have committed or taken part in during a 10-year period. Clearly, the Biden family was expecting something else to come beyond the sentencing in the cases he was facing this month already. Is that how you see it?
That's how I see the breadth of the pardon, right? That it was the Trump victory coupled with the announcement of Kash Patel to run the FBI, Pam Bondi as the Attorney General, that those were the things that perhaps may, as I said, it's a reasonable inference that they may have prompted Biden to issue the pardon that he did in that kind of sweeping language, thinking that the investigations and prosecutions of Hunter Biden were not over. But it's worth noting that the statement talks about the prosecutions to date and the convictions of Hunter Biden to date as having been the product of essentially unjust and politically motivated prosecutions. And that's striking because, of course, that's not directly attributable to Trump or any of these people who Trump is putting forward. These were prosecutions that were undertaken by the special counsel, David Weiss, who was initially a U.S. attorney appointed by Trump, but who was carried over through the Biden administration and then ultimately given the status of special counsel to continue the investigations. So at least that chapter of Hunter Biden's criminal prosecutions, those did happen under the Joe Biden administration.
I know you're not a political analyst, Professor. There are questions about what this says about Joe Biden's legacy, having run on the idea that no one is above the law. But you are a legal expert, and we heard from the Speaker of the House today who echoed the sentiment of a lot of critics here in Washington. He wrote, quote, "Trust in our justice system has been almost irreparably damaged by the Bidens and their use and abuse of it." Is he right?
Well, I think that what I would have liked to see is this pardon, if Joe Biden were moved to issue it, accompanied by pardons of other people who've gone through the normal pardon and clemency process. People may not realize that there is an entire institutionalized process for seeking a pardon. So I think what's particularly sort of striking about this, among other things, is it's for his own son. And of course, it's understandable on a human level that he would seek to pardon his son. And at the same time, there are thousands of other people who are not related to the president, who have gone through the process of seeking a pardon or clemency. And so it would have been, I think, beneficial if Biden had, if he were going to do this, attached to it or at the same time focused his attention on applications that had gone through the process and been approved at multiple levels of the Department of Justice and at the White House for people who were not related to him. And so I certainly hope, for purposes of the rule of law and his legacy, that he turns attention to those petitions that have gone through the process immediately.
We've mentioned the name Kash Patel a couple of times on the program here and in our conversation. Professor, Donald Trump's new pick to run the FBI. Patel was on the Sean Ryan podcast back in September and had a couple of things to say about his plans for the agency if he were to run the FBI. Let's listen.
I'd shut down the FBI Hoover building on day one and reopening the next day as a museum of the deep state. And I'd take the 7,000 employees that work in that building and send them across America to chase down criminals. Go be cops. You're cops. Go be cops. Go chase down murderers and rapists and drug dealers and violent offenders. What do you need 7,000 people there for?
I drive by that building every day on my way home, Professor, and it's pretty ugly. It's even fallen apart, which is why they're moving it. But the idea of turning it into a museum of the deep state got some attention here, and I wonder your thoughts on this selection, whether you think he can be confirmed.
I don't know whether he can be confirmed, but his remarks in that little snip and other remarks that he's made are deeply troubling. He is not a suitable pick, to state it mildly, to run the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which does critical work to keep this nation safe from terrorism, from so many crimes. And it's critically important that the person who runs the FBI have the experience and the professionalism to undertake that critical work and oversee the thousands of employees there, most of whom are dedicated public servants who put their lives on the line. The notion that there's somebody who would be contemplated to be put in place there with the goal of essentially dismantling that critical agency is deeply, deeply troubling, to say nothing of the comments that he's made about targeting specific individuals for investigation and prosecution. The FBI must be independent of politics. And so it's the lack of experience, the stated objective of essentially dismantling this critical organization, and the political vengeance that are three strikes that really ought to take him out of the running for this position.